We'll now move to Ed Seguine, who's the CEO of Clinical Link.
Let's see. Perfect. I think this is starting at actually the last slide. So I think I'll be a little bit different maybe than some of the other presenters. I'm not here to tell you where you might invest your money. My company is a product of regulatory clarity, and so I think that's an important aspect of this. I've spent the last 15 years focused on clinical technology companies, either as an investor. I helped Eli Lilly set up their technology venture capital group, or running kind of emerging clinical trial technology companies, trying to do things new and different, because ultimately medicines start in the lab and they rely on a patient and a physician who are trying to understand the disease, what's its outcomes, what's its impact, and there's a lot of complexity in that, and regulation certainly plays a part to ensure the viability of the data. But ultimately this is kind of, there's plenty of research and literature about the unsustainability of the cost and complexity in this early stage. And it's very fashionable to talk about bending the time and cost curves in different ways, but you have to be very pragmatic about what does that actually mean when you're going to implement and do something new. So these slides right here, these graphs, and I apologize for how small they are. I didn't realize how small they'd actually be. But on the left-hand side are a couple of charts taken from clinicaltrials.gov earlier this month. The blue bars represent those studies, number of studies that are being funded by industry, and the orange being those studies that are being funded by NIH, federal, and those graphs are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. The labels are extraordinarily small. And then the two charts on the bottom are kind of a proportional representation of what phase are the different groups, industry versus NIH, federal, kind of investing in. It's clear that industry is investing a lot into the later stage, but what's also interesting is that there's a lot of early stage research that's being done. Proportionally it's the same, and then industry has a motivation to quickly speed things to market. On the right hand side, in the bottom right hand corner, is a depiction of the total pool of clinical trial costs. And what you essentially see is more than 3/4 of those costs are involving and dealing with the complexity of managing a clinical trial. Project management, the activity of monitoring the sites, understanding what's going on, and then there's this other category of site management, basically making sure they're enrolled, they're trained, they have their stuff, which is very complicated stuff. And the technology that's deployed there is typically deployed towards efforts to kind of just manage all the inflows, not really fundamentally alter how they're doing their job. The yellow is data management. What do you do with the data when you collect it? And perversely, the green is focused on patient recruitment. Trials don't work without patients, and it's one of the smallest areas that we focus on. So where did Clinical Link come into play? So Clinical Link was founded with the premise that says if we can change the execution model for a clinical trial and focus on the patient-physician interaction in the first place and capture data at that moment, at a critical moment, it gives us the opportunity to impact the execution of the study in a way unlike you could ever do before. A lot of the activities rely on that patient-physician interaction, and then subsequently you transcribe or gather up the data later, days, weeks later, and so that obviously creates a lag on the visibility that you have, but also has a significant impact on how that trial is performed. We're doing a human experiment. Think back to chemistry days, and I was always the guy who would follow the instructions and wind up with like smoking green goo, and it didn't work because I didn't do it right. And so in the context of a big clinical trial, you're essentially relying on that consistent execution so that you have the viability and integrity of the results. And so where Clinical Link, kind of the regulatory uncertainty that was clarified earlier in 2013 was that the FDA issued some guidance known as eSource guidance, basically saying it's perfectly acceptable to start capturing clinical trial data directly, electronically in the first place without having some secondary mechanism to confirm against on paper, which is really what clinical trials generally are running. There's a study-specific worksheet. And since that time, on the top you can see a graph of kind of the number of studies that we've conducted. All of these studies are industry funded, so companies like GSK or Novartis or Roche or biotechs, different companies who are trying to experiment with different ways of execution. And on the bottom is a somewhat outdated map of where we've been deploying our technology platforms over time. And I'll talk about that here. So this idea of a different execution model for clinical trials as a way of changing the decision criteria that go through. I mean, this is a very expensive endeavor, and so if you can cut the costs, that can change the nature of the decisions around what assets do we invest in, and how quickly does it take for us to get to market. So vaccines and infectious diseases are really a great case study. The study profile is these are typically very high enrolling. So you have lots of patients at a site. A lot of these diseases are progressing very rapidly, so you're trying to understand what's going on. And in some cases, depending on where you're doing, the sites that you're using are relatively research naive in that there's not a lot of supporting infrastructure or experience around it and done in remote areas. The best example of this is that we're currently involved in some of the Ebola vaccine studies. So we have sites in the following countries running Ebola studies: Cameroon, Mali, Senegal, Nigeria. So for example, in Mali, we literally have 1,000 patients per site. That's a huge number per site. Now I would also clarify that the definition of a site is not like it's my doctor's office on the corner. These are almost like virtual sites in that they're then kind of going out to the outlying areas and then coming back, and it's a central kind of collection point for that. That, if you recall Kirsten's map, Africa was the area that was predominantly covered in white, light orange, and yellow, meaning crappy infrastructure. And so we built the platform not wishing that infrastructure environment was different, but expecting it. And so actually early on when we did this, they had little satellite internet things that would like beep when you got close just so they could connect, but the platform did not require them to be connected to the internet. They could take tablets, run off, and essentially fill out information on the tablets directly, which also served to guide the execution of the protocol. So they were doing the steps, because if they're not doing all of those steps, the data that they were collecting after the fact was almost invalid, or you had to power it to a point with number of patients that those effects would be diminished. We've also done a number of tuberculosis, malaria studies in South and East Africa, Tanzania, Ghana, Mozambique, and I want to say Zimbabwe. I always get the two Z countries down there confused. Not very good at geography. But the same kind of dynamics exist, and then we're doing we've done some Hep C work. We're currently running an RSV study that will be soon expanding into Philippines, Bangladesh, and Thailand as well. And so the key is that this execution model doesn't work if there's not regulatory clarity that says, yeah, it's totally all right for you to have electronic data as the original record. And what's interesting is that literally some of these studies in the past, they were arguing about where's the paper, and they're carrying it back and forth on the motorcycle, and some of it blows away. Not being melodramatic, it's just a hard environment to do that. And one of the things in these areas is that because of the high enrolling nature, you essentially create a giant bubble. Every time you see the patient, it's this bubble that has to work through all the operational complexity to, is the site really doing what they're supposed to? Are we monitoring the data right? The flow, and that's the complexity of executing a study that Clinical Link is attempting to kind of simplify. Pop that bubble and smooth out the effort, increase transparency, make it real time so decisions can be made. Now, vaccines, like I said, have some particularly unique use cases, but there's other priority therapeutic areas that don't necessarily affect the third world countries or these remote areas, but areas of unmet medical needs such as like CNS and pain. Alzheimer's has certainly been in the news recently. There's a lot of activities, and CNS studies in particular are extraordinarily complex, and a lot of the instruments that are used to collect data depend on a lot of specific expertise of the administrators to gather the questions, to ask a caregiver, be consistent in how they're administering those things, all pointing to the need for point of care impact. And so that point of care impact is critical to be able to have an effect on the reliability of the data. Now, not all therapeutic areas are ideal candidates in this, in that, and I'll mention this later with respect to EMRs, in that it depends to a large extent on the prevalence of study-specific activities that you're trying to understand, as opposed to an area like stroke or oncology, where you're primarily trying to save their life in the first place, and it may be based more on medical care. With respect to patients are involved in clinical trials as well. In fact, they don't happen without them. And so part of this, of our approach on this platform, is not just to make it easier for sites, but make it easier for patients to be a good patient. Patients really don't want the clinical trial to be the driving force in their life. They want to manage their disease, they want to be healthy, but they're not constantly thinking about when's my next visit. And so developed a platform that allows patients to be involved in the study, helps them understand the things that they're, simple things, reminders, integrations with their calendars, confirming their visits, knowing what they're supposed to do, some content that might say, hey, this is a 3-hour visit where you're going to get an infusion, bring a book because you're going to be bored. Things like that are part of encouraging and maintaining a patient in a clinical trial. Additionally, to the extent that there's a greater focus on sensors, even whether those may be sensors at home, that kind of make it simpler and easier for a patient to be included in a clinical trial. But there's one of the things about doing models like this is that regulations change a lot slower than the technology, and there's some basic things like, is the screen size the right size to show everything? If you're using their own phone, you obviously have to be able to send it to a cell phone number, which is technically their personal information. And so those are, depending from country to country, big hurdles on occasion. And then, of course, there's the availability of smartphones. But, that has, there's great prevalence of the availability of smartphones. We did a study that characterizes the degree to which patients use their own phones versus giving them another device, which is pretty standard in a clinical trial right now. You're going to give them another device. How many of us want to walk around with 2 devices? And even if we had a second one, are we really looking at it or using it? No. It's kind of a pretend fiction that they're going to actually be engaged with that. And our data proved that out. Actually, they interacted twice as often for 3 times as long. So this idea of putting tools in the hands of patients and motivating them, giving them things that are informative, it will work. Finally, kind of just a comment on electronic medical records. That's an area around regulations that has had a lot of focus here in the United States. It's an area that our company gets asked about all the time because, if we're used at the point of care, what about a case where there's an electronic medical record in use? Electronic medical records have no clue about how to implement a protocol, which is a very specific set of instructions. Every site has a study-specific worksheet that tells them exactly what they're supposed to do. And furthermore, every implementation of an EMR or an EHR, it is a massive data problem. I put a quote here from one of the authors of the FDA's eSource guidance that talks about how you need to be able to validate and map at each individual site with each individual EHR vendor for each pharma. Because the way that Novartis does their data is different than the way that GSK does it, is different than the way that Lilly does it. So approaches that rely on standards to fix it is wishful thinking, in that the pharma industry itself has had 19 years, 18 years of attempting to get data standards and has not been able to do it. And so you have to deploy solutions that anticipate that you're not going to be able to force standardization. And so one approach that I would advocate and recommend, to the extent that the incoming administration may be looking towards more market-driven solutions, making it more aware of, say, of pricing data, exposing charge master data from hospitals. It's the same kind of concept. If you expose the available data fields that may exist in an EMR, not the actual data, but what label do you put to your blood pressure? Do you call it BLD PRS? Do you call it blood press? Exposing those things and then letting innovators, technology companies, figure out solutions to access that and then map it and allow it to be used would be a wonderful suggestion to make it easier to rely on the creative juices of financially motivated companies and investors to solve some of these problems.
Thank you very much. Our